Hello, welcome to the next in our series on Ruth, a story of deep love. So, hopefully, last week or earlier than you're watching this, you were able to have a look at last week's, where Steve introduced us to Ruth, the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, and chapter 1. So before you go any further right now, have a little read or a look through, if you haven't already, at Ruth chapter 2. So today we're going to be looking at the whole of chapter 2. So have a pause, have a read now if you've not had a chance already. But as I say, last week Steve introduced this book, this story to us about how it's a story of grace, of kindness, of mercy, of life-changing love, and all of that in the midst of a time of grief, of loss, of struggle, of real pain and hardship. And as we go through this story, and as Steve introduced last week, some of the cultural things and ideas at the time that this story is happening, a lot of it perhaps we can't identify with or can't even really translate into our own cultural understanding right now. So a lot of those ideas might be very different, and hopefully we're going to unpack some of it for us to really get to grips and understand another level within this story whilst we go through the book of Ruth. But having said all of that, let's remember that the God we are hearing about, who provided for, who cared for, who loved the people in this story, is exactly the same God who wants to provide for, care for, and love us today. Let's hold that as we're reading and continue to read through and have an unpack of chapter 2 of Ruth today. So we pick up the story, and Ruth and Naomi are now in Bethlehem. And in the first verse of chapter 2, the narrator lets us in on something, that there's a relative of Ruth's in this place. It's a man called Boaz, who's of the family line of Elimelech. And if you remember that name, or thinking, oh, that name stands out, we heard about Elimelech last week. If you read through chapter 1, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. And there's something in the book of Ruth, and often you'll find in a lot of Old Testament books and writing, is that people's names and family names are used a lot. And that isn't just about naming people. There's a lot more to it. And in this book, we see a lot of connection to the family line. And that, again, will become more obvious and apparent to us as we go through over these coming weeks. But it also helps us to see something of the culture of the time, where actually the family you were in, the family name you were part of, had a real impact on who you were, on where you were in terms of status, on what your marriage could be, on the money you had, on the land you owned. Basically, that family name, that family line you were part of, would determine how your life could and would turn out. Again, we've talked about Elimelech, hearing him mentioned last week. We saw something of that idea of family and family links and how that all impacts lives at this particular time in culture when we were here last week. But there's another significance in this with names and family lines in the Old Testament, that we really see the names that were given added meaning to who people were, to prophecy over what that person would do in their life. Names that God wanted to give people aren't just names, there's a meaning behind those names. And I think it's worth us just pausing here to look a little bit at some of the meanings of some of the names in this story. So the name Ruth means refreshment and comfort. The name Naomi means lovely and pleasant, the total opposite. Again, chapter 1, that we saw her say, my name is now Mara, which means bitter. So total opposites there of Naomi and Mara. We've got the name Elimelech, which means my God is king. And then Boaz is introduced to us, as we've just heard in that first verse of chapter 2, and we learn more of him over this chapter, don't we? that his name is, there's various different meanings that depending on where you look and what you're looking at, but one of the meanings of his name that seemed to be taken from the original is that it means in him is strength. And I think some of those meanings add even more to this story, add even more to what we're reading here and what we're understanding of these people and what happened in their lives. As we look at Boaz, we see his strength so much in what he does and in the decisions he makes, such strength. And also that he's carrying on the family name of Elimelech by showing that God is his king, God is his master. As we see, even in this chapter, various references to God blessing and repaying people. But then in this first verse, we get another reference to the kind of person Boaz is. And the narrator tells us that Boaz is a man of standing. That's how it's put in the NIV version that I was reading from. Some versions put it in a slightly different way, but it means a very similar thing. But if we go back to the original Hebrew word that was used for that phrase, a man of standing, it's the word chael. And that word has a lot of use at various points in the Old Testament, often is used at times of real heroism or heroic acts, often is attached to someone who is a mighty warrior or soldier, but is a way of describing someone's character, not just what they do, but their character being heroic. And it's seen as a real high accolade. We'll see later on in later chapters that Boaz actually uses this same word chael to refer to Ruth. So here we're using it, we're reading it in use about Boaz, but Boaz uses it to refer to Ruth in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, this word comes up again, and people are praying it for Boaz that he will show the chael character, that will be the strongest part of him. Yes, as I've said, it has links with military people, but what this story shows us is that chael isn't just about that kind of physical battle strength, as much as that is great, but also that chael can be shown in character and standing when you're living an ordinary life, but choosing to live out a godly character that we see in Boaz in the everyday life. Living a godly character might be ordinary life, ordinary everyday, but you can still show that chael, godly character in that situation as well. This chapter really goes, I think, a long way in showing us more of the character of Ruth, as well as introducing us to Boaz, as I've said, this man of high standing, of godly character. And then as we unpack it even further, Naomi, when she realizes what's happened and what field Ruth has ended up working in, that Boaz is a relative, he's a guardian redeemer of Naomi's family, of the line of Elimelech. And just to explain here, a guardian redeemer, very briefly, is someone who by responsibility can redeem the land of a relative, it might be a distant relative, and redeem their land for them that might have to have been sold off, meaning that the family then can have an income, can have a salary, can have a future, as well as that individual, that guardian redeemer, being able to keep the family name going. And that is something that can happen, that can be put into place once the male of the family line has died. So Boaz, we're now made aware towards the end of this chapter, has a chance not only of showing chael in the ways that people know him for, but can show his chael by actually being and living out this idea of being the guardian redeemer. And obviously we will see what happens with that. What else is interesting here is that this law of chael was actually put into place by God. It was a direct, not the law of chael, but this idea of being a guardian redeemer was a law that was put in place by God as a protection for people. Not only was that guardian redeemer a law put into place by God, but actually this idea of gleaning is also a law that was put in place by God. And the idea of gleaning, so we've kind of understood now what that role, that not the role, the idea, the meaning of the word guardian redeemer is. And now let's have a little look at what gleaning actually is, the provision God had appointed for people. So it's the idea that a farmer can't harvest the edges of their fields or pick up off the floor grains that have fallen from stalks whilst they've harvested. Instead, they have to leave it for the poor to glean, for the people to come and pick up and harvest after the main harvest work has been done. It was God's way of providing for the poor, for the orphans, for the widows, for people that had nothing, to ensure they would not starve, to ensure when there was nothing else in place to look after, to protect these people, to feed these people, to make sure they would not starve. And when we see how much Ruth gleans in one day, it is by far and above how much normally someone would glean in that period of time. And that is what alerts Naomi to there being more going on here, figuring out what field it was that Ruth had ended up in, finding out who Boaz was and how he'd really blessed and rewarded Ruth for her actions towards Naomi. So we see throughout this chapter not only God's provision for people through the rules and the laws that he put down and stipulated in the time of Moses, but we also saw how someone like Boaz enacted that law of gleaning, and we'll see what happens with his godly child character as to being a guardian redeemer later on. But not only seeing how he enacts God's law, we see that his generosity over and above goes beyond what that law stipulates. He'd heard about Ruth, he'd heard what she'd done for Naomi, and he wanted to reward Ruth for the love and compassion she had shown. We go even deeper, don't we, with this idea of love during this chapter, the deep love of God for all people, for everyone, his provision. We see the love that Ruth is showing Naomi as she puts herself out there. She's ready to go to action at their point of hardship. And it could have been very dangerous for her, depending on what field and what place she'd ended in gleaning. But she ended up in the exact right place at the right time. We see the love and compassion of Boaz for people as he blesses the workers, but then blesses Ruth as well as the other people that would have been gleaning alongside Ruth. How much do we let God's love for us not just impact our lives personally, but to flow from us to impact others? How much are we looking out for those who are struggling, who are in need, who need that blessing, who need that affirmation from us to help and encourage them and to show them the love of God? As we've looked at this chapter, I really hope it helps us learn, it helps us see, it helps us think through how we can be like Ruth and Boaz for others, how we can recognise God's love is on us, around us, in us, for us, wherever we are and whatever our situations are. God bless.